Assalamu alaikum, dear listeners, and welcome to episode 3 of the Pursuit of Wisdom podcast. I'm, of course, your host, Ilyas Saoud. It's a pleasure to have you here, all 14 of you and counting. Today's episode is going to be on liberalism, or at least it was intended to be on liberalism. It's now kind of on the joint topics of liberalism and individualism. It's going to be a rather brief episode. I was constrained on time today. What I'm going to go through is a very, very brief overview of the history of the idea of liberalism and individualism, its historical roots in the history of ideas, and kind of its manifestations in society today, and then a critique and a kind of prognosis of the liberal world today. Okay, so without further ado, enjoy the show. The term liberalism pertains to a variety of political, philosophical, and even metaphysical schools of thought. Though it is thus an umbrella term, the common point of emphasis of all of the schools is that of the individual, their freedoms, and what constitutes a legitimate limitation on those freedoms. This question of the rightful liberties of the individual and their restrictions is one that has played out in the religious, philosophical, and political spheres across millennia. Over this time, we have reached a diverse range of answers to this question. Should we go back far enough, the individual as a distinct entity with its own ontology seems to be never fully recognized. Then it is given more acknowledgement, but still only has existence in relation to the group. It seems with the advent of the Christian and Islamic traditions that the individual becomes sanctified and thus fully enshrined as a distinct existent with its own inherent value. After having been thus sanctified, the question transcends from one of the individual's right of recognition to one of what this recognition entails ethically. If man is made in the image of God, if God has made life sacred, then that means individual life is not just of value, but it is of the highest value. If God made the angels bow down to Adam, then surely mankind, who is favoured above many of the creation, as the Quran states, is worthy of rights. The question then becomes what these rights ought to be and where they ought to be curtailed for the good of the collective. The topic traverses the centuries where it provokes schisms, religious wars, civil wars and revolutions, especially in the European and American sphere, up until the 20th century. Concurrent with these political developments, especially in the post-so-called Enlightenment era, was the critique of established socio-cultural and religious traditions, which resulted in the ever-decreasing boundaries of these traditions in the social and individual lives, with an inverse effect on the boundaries of individual liberty. To the effect that moral restrictions on the individual in society have become increasingly reduced, and boundaries of the realm of individual freedom, especially as it pertains to identity, have become drastically increased. But what are the rightful limitations on individual liberty? What is the rightful balance between self and social or divine determination? Can placing ultimate value on individual self-expression violate the rights and well-being of the community? And should we bow to the diktats of the self? Should we take the ego as our shepherd, or is there a more beneficial and worthy place from which we should direct our action? This episode attempts to briefly answer these questions, though admittedly not in the depth that they might deserve. Section 1, on the historical roots of liberalism. It is difficult to know when one should start an analysis into the historical roots of liberalism. Should it be when the term is first coined and used? Should it be when its current form first became manifest in society? Or should it be at that moment in time when distinctive traces of the tradition first came onto the philosophical and historical scene? I have decided upon the latter and have thus made ancient Greece, and to be specific, the city-state of Athens, my point of origin. In Athens in the 5th century BC, the father of Athenian democracy, as he came to be known, Cleisthenes, introduced reforms that led to the transition from tyranny to a new mode of governance known as democracy. This new form of government was premised on the notion that the rightful seat of sovereignty sits not with the whims and desires of one man or of one select bloodline, but in the collective will of its citizens. This transition marks a significant alteration in the dynamics between the individual and the authority that governs them. By granting the right of autonomy to the collective by way of recognizing the sovereignty of its members, they place the individual on an entirely new level of authority and value. Now, far from being the footstool of the kings and the playthings of emperors, the citizen could be self-directing and play an active part in the direction of his life. As the transition from tyrannical rule to democratic rule altered the political status of the individual in Athens, so did the emergence of the Abrahamic religions affect the spiritual status of the individual across the world. In Genesis 1:26-27, it is stated that man is created in God's image, a radical statement that negates the idea of man as a mere created thing, akin to the rest of creation, and instead makes him something of ultimate value. Similarly, in the Quran, chapter 15, verses 28-29, it is stated, وَإِذَا قَالَ رَبُّكَ الْمَلِكَاتِ إِنِّي خَلَقٌ شَرًا مِّن صَلْصَالٍ مِّن حَمَإٍ مَسْنُونٍ فَإِذَا سَوَّعْتُهُ وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي فَقَعُوا saja'idin. Your Lord said to the angels, I will create a mortal out of dried clay formed from dark mud. When I have fashioned him, Adam, and breathed my spirit into him, bow down before him. This idea that the Almighty, the Lord of the universe, breathed some of his own perfect spirit into Adam, then commanded the angels bow down to him, indicates to us the level of esteem and high rank which members of mankind innately possess. This sanctification of the individual emerged in conjunction with divine laws that would enshrine the rights of these individuals and forever determine the rightful codes of behavior that they ought to have in society and towards themselves. And this, as I've mentioned, is an innovation, or something of an innovation. In previous societies in history, there were no such idea of the sanctification of the individual. You were the property of a king. You were a member of a community who could be disposed of for the general good. There was not this sanctification and protection of the individual as the possession of God. Now, you also have the Reformation, and in the Reformation it's a period of time in around about the high medieval, 16th century, 15th, 16th century, where figures such as Martin Luther and Calvin are essentially forming Protestantism. It's the origins of Protestantism, which is a schism away from the Catholic Church. It's a move away from the arbitrary impositions of the Catholic Church and the hierarchical structure of the Catholic Church into extremely localized individual relationships between Scripture and God. So you've gone from your interface with Christianity has changed from being one where the priest was the mediator, the sole mediator between kind of heaven and earth, and he spoke, did the sermon in Latin, and you couldn't read your own scriptures and you couldn't understand the sermons. It's gone from that and outsourcing all moral kind of diktats and moral lessons to this priest and to the organization of the church, to being able to translate the scriptures into vernacular and having now a personal understanding of religion. And anyway. So it is the early modern period when we see the individual begin to take primacy in political and philosophical thought. Philosophers like Locke considered widely to be the father of liberalism, armed with this Christian-derived axiom of the innate value of the individual, set about determining the rightful boundaries of individual freedoms and the legitimate dynamics between the ruler and the ruled. In his 2 treatises on government, Locke states, "The natural liberty of man is to be free from any superior power on earth, and not to be under the will or legislative authority of man, but to have only the law of nature for his rule." Man is free by nature. It is his right to be free and autonomous, i.e. self-governing, and he only enters into political bodies and thus grants some of his freedoms of choice to the collective, so that he might utilize the strength and order inherent within the collective to protect his own interests. In his letter concerning toleration, Locke argues for the separation of church and state and denounces the idea that the civil legal system has the right to enforce religious belief. The care of souls is not committed to the civil magistrate any more than it is to other men. Then going on to say, it can't be up to the magistrate to take care of souls because his power consists only in outward force, whereas true and saving religion consists in the inward faith of the soul, without which nothing can be acceptable to God, and which the nature of the human mind won't allow to be compelled by any outward force. The so-called Enlightenment era was one that was defined by man's emergence from the shadows of ignorant faith, or so they believe, to the age of enlightened reason. No longer would we accept that what was traditional was true. No longer would we look to Scripture for guidance on the moral and metaphysical nature of man and reality. This age and the subsequent ones leading up to the present day, is supposedly defined by an adherence to pure, empirically observable and scientifically provable facts. It is an age where man, hitherto the handiwork and possession of God, believes that he has become man 2.0. That is, he has become his own God. He looks no longer to the heavens for guidance, but believes that he can guide himself to truths about morality, his nature, and the nature of the wider world. Nowhere is this encapsulated better than in the 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche's proclamation that, I quote, "God is dead and we have killed him," end quote. Having believed that God was indeed dead, and that his laws and scriptures were arresting humanity to a protracted age of ignorance, we attempted to conjure up our own sources of value and ethical systems. One such system of values that is most characteristic of this post-Enlightenment era, and one that has had considerable influence on liberal thought, is that of Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism. This is a moral science that states that the ultimate good in human life is the maximization of pleasures and the minimization of pain. Bentham, armed with this premise, devises an ethical system that bases the legitimacy of every action on the amount of utility, i.e. the pleasure to harm ratio, it creates. I quote, "A created thing is said to promote the interest, A thing is said to promote the interest or be for the interest of an individual when it tends to add to the sum total of his pleasures. This theory is particularly interesting when contrasted to the ethical systems of traditional religions. Whilst utilitarianism places the maximization of pleasure as the ultimate value, Abrahamic religions place piety as their ultimate value. A state of obedience to God that takes one away from the mere satisfaction of their appetites to a state of rational self-control. 19th century philosopher John Stuart Mill wrote in his essay on liberty a defense of many of the elements of liberal society that we still have today. Such notions as the harm principle, i.e., and I quote, "the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others." Or freedom of speech, and I quote, "the peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth," end quote. This essay is a classic of liberal thought and proved to be extremely influential in the policies of liberal governments and is extremely influential in the framework of all liberal societies today. What I think is very interesting in the case of John Stuart Mill is for all of his talk of, the inalienable rights of freedom and how we are innately free and of value as individuals. He famously argued for essentially despotism, the legitimacy of despotism when involving barbarian or savage, uncivilized communities, and how they don't deserve democracy because they're unable to think for themselves, essentially part of the civilizing mission. So yes, whilst Mill argued for tolerance, it was only tolerance within a restricted framework of things that he thought should be tolerated. But when it came to people who he thought to be inferior, or ideas he saw to be barbaric and inferior, then he didn't tolerate them at all and believed actually that despotism was the best approach. What the above developments in the conception of the individual and individual liberties has led to today is a society radically different, in fact unrecognizably different from the society of even a generation ago. Liberal thought, that is the school of thought that sees the individual as primary, is now rampant. What began with a severance from the arbitrary domination of established political institutions like monarchy or the Catholic Church led across the centuries to an initial critique, then decline, and now near death of traditional institutions, religious values, and even objective fact. The ultimate value of the age is no longer to be pious, not to obey God and his decrees, nor to dedicate oneself to serving his creation, but to serve the self, its whims and its desires. Whilst in prior ages mankind has been bridled by a morality that presided over us from heaven, if you will, modern man has turned his face from that and is attempting to write his own law and be his own guiding light. We have gone from being sheep, shepherded by the all-knowing, to a flock attempting to herd ourselves. We have gone from being Abdullah, that is slaves of God, to Abdul Nafs, slaves of the self. A most unworthy master, and indeed one that is leading us only to our demise. One need only look to the last century of history, its Bolshevik and Maoist revolutions, and the combined slaughter of some 60 million souls for the sake of that hellish secular ideology, or to World War II and its senseless murder and destruction on an unprecedented global scale, the creation and utilization of the nuclear bomb, a hellish weapon that has enabled mankind for the first time not to destroy himself, but to destroy the entire natural world. Look to the epidemic of substance abuse in our societies, how it has poisoned the bodies of both the individual and the social body itself. Look to the attacks on the institution of family and parenthood, which has led some non-traditional populations to the path of extinction. Diseases of both the body and mind are now rules rather than exceptions. We drink, we consume with the utmost gluttony whatever our appetites desire of food, drink, entertainment, and pleasure, with little heed to the ramification of this on our spiritual and mental health, the health of the environment or of our communities. And now, in perhaps the ultimate expression of our blindness, we have denied the existence of such objective categories as gender or even species. All of the above is the consequence of a deviation from truth. We let go of the rope of the transcendent that was pulling us out of the darkness of the animal world. By doing so, we are like children attempting to guide themselves through the world, falling into blunder upon blunder, and, being so unguarded, falling victim to malevolent forces. We must remember it was Allah that taught Adam the names, and it was this being taught that led the angels to bow down before him. We did not teach ourselves. When we attempt to do so, as when a child attempts to do so, we stray very far from what is right. To put it in other terms, the way to success are very few and narrow. The ways to destruction are manifold and broad. It is of my opinion that should we remain lorded over by the individual, should we place ultimate value in our own self-directedness, we as a species will not last much longer, and that period of time in which we do will be miserable. Better for us to realize the perennial truths inherent within the divine word and hang fast to it. Better for us to substitute what's better for what's worse.